The first screen here I'm sharing is one of my favorite places in Sherbrooke to walk around. It's the Marais de Saint-François, which is in our neck of the woods, and it's a beautiful marsh area protected by nature. And this is a fall scene that I took last fall, and unfortunately we can't go there. It's closed off to the public because of the social distancing. But it's something that I like to remind myself of when we finally get back to our normalcy. So Megan had asked me to start the presentation by talking a little bit about myself, so that you can sort of understand where I'm coming from, who I am, and some of the information that I'll share with you today. So, excuse me. So my academic background is quite normal. I originally was born in Shanghai, China, but I immigrated to Canada at a very young age, and I had most of my education and upbringing in Ontario. I did my honors Bachelor of Science at the University of Toronto, and there I pursued biology and forensic science. I also minored in French literature because that was always languages always fascinated me. And so I didn't sort of forsake the artistic and the language aspects of my education just to pursue the sciences. And I think having the ability to understand, speak, and read French was something that served me quite well, because now I'm working at a Francophone university. And as I was able to tap into those opportunities that are available at Francophone universities that were available when I was looking for a job. That was my bachelor's. And looking back, I think that served me very well. Following my bachelor's, I didn't really know what I wanted to do. Wasn't sure if I wanted to go to med school right away. Wasn't sure if I wanted to pursue graduate studies. And I think it's okay to not know. And at that point, I decided, you know what, I wanted some hands-on experience. I love the sciences. So I pursued, actually, I went to college after university. And there I got certification, got a lot of hands-on lab experience, becoming an MLT in Ontario, a medical lab technologist. Specifically, I was at the Michener's. For those of you who are in Toronto, you know exactly where I'm talking about, the Michener's Institute for Applied Health Sciences. It's right by the St. George campus at U of T. And I pursued diagnostic cytology. And basically for 2 years of my life, I screened pap smears and non-gynecological pathology smears in a hospital setting. And that really sort of pushed me towards, I think I want more out of my professional life. I asked a lot of questions. Why are we depending on just visual inspection of cancerous cells? There are PCR methods, there are vaccines, and this was in the early 2000s, there are vaccines that are being developed for HPV. And so I really started asking some of those questions, and I thought at that time, it made sense for me to pursue graduate studies. And so from there, I applied to immunology. I started my master's first and then transferred successfully to a PhD at McGill. Specifically, I worked with Dr. Andrew Macrianis, who is a basic immunologist. Right now, he's the chair of the Department of Microbiology and Immunology at Dalhousie University. But I was his first PhD student when he got his job at the ESAM in Montreal. And there I had a very basic immunology PhD training, studied natural killer cells, studied dendritic cell biology, and I had a very well-rounded molecular and cellular immunology background. And when that was done, I thought, you know, I don't want to become a mouse scientist. I was really, I wanted to sort of leverage my academic background, my academic immunology, to understand human diseases and human immunology, immune pathology. And there I reached out to Dr. John Bell and Dr. Rebecca Auer at the Ottawa Hospital Institute. Started my postdoctoral fellowship for them in the field of cancer immunology and immune therapy, immune response to cancer, in the perioperative immune suppressive period, and to look at oncolytic viruses. And so that sort of education, basic immunology, and then applied human immunology and immune therapy was my background. But when I finished my postdoc, I really wanted to, I think I knew that I wanted to become a PI. It wasn't something that I knew all along. It was sort of midway through my postdoc that I thought that, you know, I really wanted to assume my own successes and assume my own failures. And it was at that time period I thought, you know, this really propelled me forward to look for a PI job, to become an assistant professor in cancer immunology and in immunology in general. So at that point, I actually applied to just to give you a little bit about how I got my job in one slide, I applied to 5 academic universities. I applied to University of Sherbrooke, McGill University, U of T, Brock, and also University of Ottawa. At the same time, being very pragmatic, I didn't want to sort of forget about the non-academic institutes. I had also applied, and at that time I was living in Ottawa. I applied to the NRC, so the National Research Council of Canada, the RCMP as well. Excuse me. And I also considered staying on as a research lab manager, as a research associate for Dr. John Bell and for Dr. Rebecca Auer. So I was I knew I wanted to become a PI, but it's also pragmatic enough to know that if I couldn't find a job right away, I was okay with continue to productively work on my CV to pursue a PI position. I was fairly fortunate. I received 2 academic interviews, one at the University of Ottawa and one at the University of Sherbrooke. And there it was really a whirlwind of academic interviews. There was, and I'm really distilling it down, and I hope that if BioCanRx does more of these mentoring sessions involving how to prepare for an academic interview, you'll get more details on this. But there was a job talk where you presented the research you're proposing to do. There was a chalk talk when you talked about what your first CIHR grant will look like. There were countless individual meetings with members of the department, with the dean, the vice dean, et cetera, and also meetings and pizza lunches with the students, because they were also there to evaluate you. How would you be as a lecturer, et cetera. Again, out of 5 different places that I applied to, 2 interviews, and I was offered a job at the University of Sherbrooke. I jumped on that because for me, in some ways, it was almost like I didn't know what I wanted until I arrived in Sherbrooke. I think it's the best way to explain it. Sherbrooke has an amazing quality of life. It's a small enough city, but close enough to all the major amenities, close enough to Montreal, that really you can have the best of both, in a perfect place to pursue your research, because the biomedical research at Sherbrooke is extremely strong, but at the same time to have a really good quality of life to raise a family. So I jumped on the offer from Sherbrooke, and I think before I even arrived, about a year before I arrived, and so this whole process took about a year and a half. I started looking for jobs in 2015. I arrived in Sherbrooke in July 2016, but from 2015 to 2016, while I was still wrapping up my postdoc for John and for Rebecca, I was already writing grants, because right now it's slightly different because some of these are no longer available in terms of salary awards. But the expectations were that I applied to FRQS salary awards, CIHR salary awards. There was a CRS bridging grant that I applied to that basically I started writing before I even arrived. And as you can imagine, as an assistant professor, and if there are any of you out there in this webinar as well, once you arrive, all you really do is write grants. So I remember in my first year, my first 2-3 years, has been writing grant after grant after grant. Some of them successful, some of them not successful. Personnel hiring was another major component, because you really need to have people in the lab, because if you're writing grants, then you're not pipetting at the bench. So really it's hiring the right personnel, hiring graduate students, undergrad students, et cetera, and then mentoring them and training them at the same time. Another component of my job in the past 3 years has also been obviously teaching. Teaching both undergraduate and graduate level courses, and also endless meetings and committee meetings, both internal and external. And so if I had to sort of wrap up sort of the last 3 years of my life, I think that, and in terms of the important skills that allowed me to do well, are management skills. Those are definitely things, managing people, getting along with your colleagues. Communication skills are really, really important as well. And I sort of broke that down into both writing and oral. So writing, endless writing of grants, of papers that are coming out of your lab, and if you want to do animal work or access human samples, endless ethical protocols to write and to submit and to rebut. And obviously for the oral, there's the teaching, and there's also being invited to sit on review committees, being invited to speak at other universities and institutes, so the presentation skills. And the other component would be the technical, right? A lot of endless day-to-day troubleshooting for your students' experiments, for your own experiments, data analysis and troubleshooting of other people's grants. So this is sort of a pie chart of what my life, my professional life looks like. In black, the black labels on this pie chart are pre-COVID pandemic, pre-quarantine, and then in white is sort of the I sort of affectionately call it what my life is like now in the past 3 weeks, going on to week 4. So what did my typical workday look like 3 weeks ago? And so the majority of my time was spent on my research, and I sort of broke that down into spending a lot of time daily with my students, writing grants, and if I'm not writing grants, then I'm writing papers so I can write more grants, and writing protocols and troubleshooting. So I would think that was a good, 60% of my day. Another big third of my day was spent on planning and attending both institutional and external meetings, endless meetings at the university. And then sort of the remaining third was spent on teaching. I've had a very research-intensive university, so mostly it's graduate level teaching, although I do reach out and do some undergraduate teaching for virology, immunology, and pharmacology. But teaching is actually a minority of my time. And then I think I was being optimistic here that I actually spend a portion of my day, maybe it's minutes, reading and thinking about my research, about research that's going on in the world, how to position myself to become successful. And so I think that's sort of what my days looked like pre-COVID. And now during the quarantine, it's completely different. I think, I have 2 young children at home, and so now the majority of my time is spent parenting. Although right now my husband has stopped working momentarily for an hour while he parents them. So parenting and trying to juggle work is a big part of my day, and working out a homeschooling schedule for them. The other part is distance management of my lab, making sure that they're motivated, and I think some of them are on this webinar today. Trying to talk to them at least once a week, and then having a lab meeting once a week, and our mini journal club lab meetings once a week to see how they're doing, whether they're meeting their objectives in terms of their distance learning. They're still teaching, so we do a lot of teaching through virtual learning now at the university, although now it's wrapping up and it's final exam time. And I think the reading and the thinking is still happening all the time, but more and more it's focused on sort of COVID and how my immunology expertise can contribute towards that. So I think enough about, so last slide to talk about me. And so really I think about myself as performing this sort of translational research where I kind of straddle this valley. Often people call us the valley of death because it's actually quite steep. I try to do basic research in the lab, and sometimes I think I'm not a good enough basic scientist because I don't do all basic research. I also try to do translational and clinical research, and obviously I'm not an MD, I'm just a PhD. So I think I get a lot of, well, what do you know about clinical research? And so trying to sort of straddle the two, getting patient samples, running the basic lab assays to understand what's going on with disease, sort of going back and forth in terms of my thoughts, in terms of our protocols, in terms of the experiments almost daily to try to do this, what we call translational research, applying basic research for the health of Canadians. So enough about me. I'm going to start our webinar on writing scientific review papers. And right before I start that, I can just say that obviously I'm not the authority on writing scientific review papers. I wanted to make sure that I set up your expectations. I am, which is why the title is called An Assistant Professor's Guide to Writing Scientific Review Papers, not the Nature Editor's Guide to Writing Scientific Review Papers. It's my perspective, and I think it's very important that you work with your PI and with your other mentors who've had many, many years of writing to move your review papers forward. But I'd like to give you a general perspective and, more importantly, my perspective on what's worked for me in terms of writing and putting together good scientific review papers. And so my writing credentials, since I started my own lab, has been, we've already put out 2 review papers. We published 2. One was an invited review, and I'll go into sort of what's the difference between an invited review versus a solicited review. One was an invited review. We were invited by editors of the journal Viruses to submit a review paper. And then the other one was a solicited review. I reached out to a couple of mentors and to an editor of the journal to say that I would like to write a timely review on a topic of my choice. And both have been successfully published. So I think I'd like to start by talking about why scientific review papers are useful. Why are they important? Why do we bother? Why don't we just all write primary papers? Why do we need scientific review papers, and why are they useful? I think they sort of come from 4 different very important reasons. they help us to organize, evaluate, and distill all the information that's out there, right? You think about all the number of COVID papers, well, at least in preprint at this point, that are out there. At some point, there are going to be some very good review papers that are going to try to put together this information to synthesize all these disparate viewpoints and try to come together with a consensus of what seems to be disease progression, what seems to be the right therapy. So they help us, review papers help us organize, evaluate, and distill information so that we don't have to read all the primary papers that are out there. They also serve as an educational tool. They educate scientists, they educate us, trainees, and others on the scientific literature that's out there, and others can include patients, policymakers, etc. Importantly, they also provide a bridge between different disciplines. So same with the COVID example, they can provide a bridge between virologists and immunologists, or immunologists and epidemiologists, or structural chemists who are coming up with inhibitors of the receptor for viral entry and putting them together with immunologists. So I think they provide review papers provide a really good bridge between the different scientific disciplines. And important that they also direct and shape future research, right? Normally in the discussion section of a review, we talk about, where is this field going? What's going to be the next big thing? What are the clinical, what is the clinical impact of this research, and how do we scale up for manufacturing? How do we develop a vaccine against COVID, et cetera? So I think these are some of the reasons why scientific review papers are important. And so why would you write a scientific review paper? And I'm sort of giving my point of view, my perspective on some good reasons and not so good reasons to write a scientific review paper. I think this is kind of an unpopular reason. In my opinion anyway, not a very good reason. Is you want to learn about a new subfield. So I would say if you're a first-year master's or first-year PhD, it may not be a good idea to be writing a scientific review paper right away. That said, it's a really good idea to read about the field, read other scientific reviews in your field, in your subfield. But maybe it's not the time to write your own review paper, and I'll go into a little bit more detail there. So I think if you're here to learn about a field and you're completely new, it's not a good reason to start a scientific review paper. And it also is not, adding another line to your publication in your CV is not a good reason to write a scientific review paper. Okay, I might have some disagreement there from some of you. Some practical reasons as to why write a scientific review paper. I think it's an opportunity to demonstrate your expertise in the field. On average, reviews are cited and downloaded more than primary research articles. It's also an opportunity to think deeply about the state of your subfield. So those are some practical reasons as to why you want to write a scientific review paper. Some good reasons are what I provided in the last slide, to distill the information, to provide an educational tool to bridge fields, to shape the future of research. And I think probably the best reason and an excellent reason to write a scientific review paper is that you have something to say that is valuable. You can provide an insight. You have an expertise that cannot be directly obtained from reading the primary empirical literature, or you're bringing together two fields that is not obvious, or that's an emerging field. And in your second year master's, your second, third year PhD, you've had some valid bench time under your expertise, and now it's time to put together your thoughts to write a review paper. So I think that's an excellent reason to write a scientific review paper, but maybe not so much in the beginning when you're just learning about the field. But that said, it's a good time to start assembling all the literature, the things that you need to write a review paper, to put together an outline that could also serve for your thesis and for your memoir. The next question is, do I need to be invited to write a review paper? And so the answer is yes and no. I think it's important to understand the journal's model. So depending on the journal that you want to submit to, there are some journals that have direct submissions. So if you go to the website, there's a direct open call for review papers. So that there's a call in the field is what you're working in, and so it fits perfectly. And so you want to submit to this. Sometimes it's by invitation only, and so there is no advertisement for, there is no call. And an editor, knowing that you or your boss is working in a specific field, will contact you to write a review paper. Often, you've just submitted a first author publication, And this is followed a month later by the same journal who wants you to write a review paper or a mini review of the field. And you can also contact the editor. So if you're not invited or you don't see a call, you can also contact the editor and your mentors to see if you can submit a pitch, a review paper. And so that's sort of a what we call a pre-submission inquiry. In other words, soliciting a journal. Should you bother, and this basically, you contact the editor and you just kind of find out, should I bother to submit this topic to your journal? And also then the editor will let you know if the subfield or the topic that you're pitching, whether it's suitable for this journal. And so you notice that I didn't include any information here about some journals that would solicit you. So by invitation only has to be very specific and targeted. They write to your PI and they're asking for a specific topic, and it's from a reputable journal. A lot of us get daily, we're inundated by journals, most of them fraudulent, with invitations to write review papers. And usually they're not specific at all, it's just a general call. Normally those I ignore. Good journals don't solicit you, you need to solicit them. And so when you solicit them, or if there's a call, usually the next step is preparing a short proposal, okay? This allows you to understand what the journal wants, and the journal also doesn't want you to waste your time on something that is out of scope or out of format. And so if the journal, the editor of the journal wants you to submit a review paper, or if it's you solicited them and they agree that the topic you're pitching is good for them, then they want to make sure that the content and the tone are a good fit. So this time they'll usually ask you to prepare a short proposal. And so the proposal and the eventual review paper usually, in my opinion, pivots around these 5-6 questions, right? So this is the content of the review paper. So what is the central thesis? What exactly is the topic? What is the question that you're asking? Why does this matter? Importantly, why does this matter now? Okay, there are a lot of top-notch journals look for very timely topics. So right now, every journal in the world is looking for SARS coronavirus 2 COVID-related papers. This matters now because there's currently a pandemic. Zika virus research mattered because at that time there was an epidemic. Cancer immunology, immune therapy matters because this is the fourth pillar of cancer and it's an emerging field. So these are all topics and questions that you should ask yourself. Also, what is the tone of this paper? Who is the audience I intend to reach? And I think it's important to sort of think about whether or not your review paper is positioned distinctly from other review papers, right? Because you're offering a unique perspective. You're not just stringing together a whole bunch of results and putting it out as a distilled version of results. That's not the point. It's what is your viewpoint. So what to include in the proposal before writing the full review paper. Megan?
Yeah, I just muted everyone. You may need to unmute yourself. That's what you're asking.
Okay, sorry about that. So I was just hearing a lot of background noise. It's important to think about what is the format of the review, because writing a scientific review paper is not just one format. There's a long review, there are short reviews, there are opinion pieces, there are many different forms of review. So it's important to think about what is the format of this review. And obviously I can't go into all the different kinds of reviews because that, again, depends on the field, depends on the journal. In your proposal, so you should think about what kind of review you're submitting. Is it a 10-page review? Is it a 2-page review? It's important to include all the authors and affiliations. It's important to have a summary of the scientific content. And so normally this is the outline or the abstract that you're submitting as part of the proposal. And often in a short proposal, there are also key references that you want to include. Sometimes some editors want you to include a key figure, an approximate word count of how many words you think your entire thing is going to be. And often your own publication history might need to be included to showcase your expertise. So this is sort of the short proposal to submit before you even start writing the review. after submitting the review, sometimes you might get rejected. And so this is actually a good point, because you don't want to be rejected after you've written the actual review paper. So
Sorry to interrupt, Lee. I just got a note that the presentation may not be visible. Can you just double check that you're still sharing your slide?
Sure, yeah.
And could others maybe just weigh in? I'm not sure if it's a specific issue one person is having or if it's a full issue. I can see it, so I think it might. Okay, so I think it might just be that one person. I'll respond to them directly. Sorry about that.
It's okay. Okay, so where was I? So what if the editor rejects your proposal? And I think this is actually, if you want rejection to happen, it's good to happen now versus happening later on, right? Because then you've wasted all your time to write a full review paper. But I think a short proposal of 1 page and they reject it, that's not a bad thing. It doesn't mean that your proposal was bad. It could mean that they have other reviews that are forthcoming in their pipeline. It could also mean that your particular field isn't quite established yet, especially if you're trying to bridge 2 different fields. It could be an emerging field, an emerging topic, but it's not quite ready yet for prime time. It could also be that your proposal was out of scope. So maybe depending on the mandate of the journal, et cetera, it's important to make sure that there's a good fit between your proposal and what they want. It could also be that their pipeline is too full to add anything new. So I think if your proposal gets rejected, it's not actually a bad thing. It's not necessarily the end of the line. It could be that the aim of the review is just not quite novel enough, so you might need to revise to add novelty or to adjust the scope, like I said. You might need to change the format. So maybe it's not good for a long review, but it could be written as a shorter review. You might want to approach the editor again in a few months. There's also the option of inviting other authors, maybe to add some expertise to this particular paper. And obviously, you can always pitch the same proposal to another journal. I think the consistency and the accessibility, and so this comes down to the writing. It's really important that in your review paper, you avoid jargon, right? You want to write in a very clear way, because the broader the journal scope, the harder this is going to be. So it's important that you try to write in the most concise way possible. You might want to include a glossary of all the different abbreviations, all the different meanings. You want to make sure that you're not inventing new definitions or new abbreviations. Make sure that you stick to definitions that conform with the nomenclature and the accepted meanings in your particular subfield. So now's not the time to come up with your own expressions and things like that. Make sure you conform to what is acceptable in your field. And make sure that the terms are used consistently throughout, right? We're writing a scientific review paper, not an opinion piece for a lay newspaper. Remember that also you're the expert. This is why you're writing this review. But you also you cannot assume that every reader knows as much as you do. It's important that you set up the reader's expectations and that you take them by the hand and sort of lead them through the park. You need to lead them through your story, through your review, and explain to them why you're writing this review paper. And so here's the actual, how I sort of think of the organization of an actual scientific review paper. Again, it's important to start with an outline. If the journal has accepted your proposal, then it means your outline was good. But it's important to go back to your outline when you start writing the actual paper. So start with an outline. You need to have introduction and concluding sections, right? There's a good half page, there's a good half page of introduction and maybe half a page to a page of concluding and perspective section. And then the body of the review paper should have 4 to 6 main sections. And in my opinion, under each main section, you might need to have 2 to 3 subsections. For these sections, it's really important to use structured headings, right? You actually write down what is the particular title of this particular subsection. It helps with the organization of the information, and it's also important for yourself and for the reader to show that there's adequate and balanced attention to all aspects of the review. You're just not writing about one side of the story. A good review paper covers all aspects of a particular problem, of a particular hypothesis. And I'm not going to go into, you have to use a good reference management program, whether it's EndNote, Mendeley, reference manager, etc. Citing as you write, creating a good library for every particular topic or every paper you're writing is really, really important. And that needs to be done from the start. And I don't think I need to do that because all of our trainees are much more technologically savvy than we are. I think it's really important to keep in mind what is novel about your review, what is unique about it, because like I said before, a review is not a collection of results, right? A reader should, because they can read that themselves. They can read 10 papers and make their own conclusion. And your review should not just be a mishmash of these results. The reader should learn something new about the field because of your review. They should walk away with a different perspective, with your perspective. Because what you're doing is you're comparing, you're critiquing, you're assessing, and you're also including your own work, obviously. You're trying to synthesize divergent ideas, and you're writing down your ideas for future experiments. A good review paper should not just be future work is needed in this field. You should actually provide experimental ideas, provide avenues for future research, more than just a statement that future work is needed. And I think a good exercise this is for our students as well. When they present their WIPs and their seminars, it's not enough just to say, I think we need to do more work in this particular area, but what are the actual experiments that we should do? And also importantly, I think a good review paper provides a path to clinical translation, if that's the goal of that particular review. Also a path to the market, right? How is this drug going to enter into the market? Industrial scale up, how are we actually going to engineer and manufacture this particular biotherapy or this particular vaccine? So I think a path to clinical translation, how you envision it being used in clinical studies, is very important as part of the discussion and the perspectives. And I think it's also important, like I said from the beginning, to manage your readers' expectations. I think right from the beginning, you should tell your readers why this topic is timely and why it is important now, okay? You have to acknowledge, probably in the opening paragraph, that this particular review you're writing is not exhaustive. This is not the only review out there on this topic. You can refer, but you don't have to touch on the other topics. You refer them to other reviews and say, you know, a discussion of particular topic X has been reviewed by these other review papers, and you cite them. So acknowledge other reviews and explain how your review is different. And then finally, you finish with a concluding section in the discussion and perspective section. I think it's very important to understand that the review that you're writing is meeting journal's requirements. I think there's some flexibility in terms of word limits. If they say 6,000, that's it. Can't be a word over. That's not usually how that works. I think there is some flexibility, but you need to respect it overall. If you're, say, 50% of the word count, you really, really do need to cut down. And there might be different standards for your initial submission versus the revised version. So be flexible and be ready to format multiple times. If it's minor formatting requirements, they could be addressed later on. And I think the important thing is basically to just start writing. It's important, obviously, once you finish writing your first draft to actually review your review, right? It's going to take many drafts. You need to read it from start to finish, especially if you're not the only person writing this review paper. Often our PI might say, we're going to write a review on this particular topic. Lee, you're working on this section. Christine, you're working on this other section. Guillaume, you're working on the other section. So there's multiple authors working on this. And then you need to put it all together. You need to review it from beginning to end to make sure, do the transitions make sense? Does it set one particular tone? It can't be a review paper with multiple personalities, right? So you need to make sure that the tone is consistent and read it from the perspective of a reader. Obviously, make sure that you're not missing out on anything, depending on the journal. You may need a glossary section. The acronyms have to be spelled out. If you have a particular figure or model that's included, you have to have a figure call out, like a legend. And there might be other required sections. It's also important that to contact the editor if you have any questions, because they are there to help your review succeed. Because if they accepted your proposal or if they solicited you in the beginning, they probably thought it was a good idea to start with. They like the topic that you want to write about. And they know that there's substantial time and energy invested from you. So they may be able to offer suggestions to you and also help you out to respond to reviewers' concerns when you finally submit the review paper. When you do finally submit your review paper and you get reviewers' comments back, and I think definitely you will get reviewer comments back, possibly even multiple rounds of reviewers. It's important that you really engage with the reviewers' comments. You can't just superficially do what they say to do or include one reference that they suggested that you include. It's important that you really read and take the time to address their concerns. When, for example, when a reviewer says you must rewrite this particular section because the viewpoint is not balanced, you forgot to mention these particular studies, you can't just clean up one or two sentences. You may need to rewrite that entire subsection. So really taking the time to address it. Sometimes review manuscripts may or may not be sent back to the reviewer, depending on the editor, depending on the journal. And so I can wrap up here by giving sort of a couple of sort of the main take-home messages for this particular scientific review paper writing webinar. Like I said, a review is not a list of results. It's important that you offer a perspective, that you try to synthesize divergent results. Only write a review if you feel you really have something to say, obviously. And if possible, submit a proposal or an outline before writing the actual review manuscript to see if it matches the scope of the particular journal that you're targeting. Also, be really clear on why this particular topic is important. Why is it important now, and why should your particular lab write it? Because you are the world experts on this particular subfield. You need to be able to manage reviewers' expectations from the beginning. Tell them what exactly the objectives are for this particular review, and tell them that these other topics that are out of scope may not be addressed, so that you refer them to other review papers. Expect to write many drafts, especially if this review writing involves many people in your lab. You should also try your best to follow the journal's formatting guidelines right from the beginning, so that there isn't major formatting to do as you go along. And remember that if you've been invited to submit a review paper, the editor wants you to succeed. So from experience, I find that the editor is good to work with you. They'll give you suggestions on how to even answer certain reviewers' comments. So I'll conclude there, and I think I had a little PhD comic at the end. It's also important, keeping all the things that I said in mind, it's also important to just start writing, right? There's no way you can pound out a perfect draft from the beginning. In the beginning, it will just be a collection of results, but you need to start somewhere, because you can't write a synthesis of these results if you don't have a running tally of what those results are. So I think it's important to understand that you're going to do many drafts, but it's important just to start writing. So with that, I'm open to questions. And Megan, it's up to you if you want to unmute the microphones if people want to ask questions, or whether they'll send in their questions via chat.
So first, Lee, thanks very much for that. I think we can open it up to both options. So I'll be monitoring the chat box, and if folks want to unmute themselves, either just audio or video, then that's an option as well. So I'll just get a minute. Are there any questions by audio? Okay, in that case, I thought maybe I'd ask a first couple of questions. So you actually ended with what I was thinking. I remember being an early grad student myself, and I understand the just start writing, but even that can be tricky because, as you mentioned, you're accumulating results at the beginning. Do you have any tips and tricks for reading review paper, or rather reading papers, any systems that you use for gathering that info in terms of taking notes, things like that, basically just so that when it comes down to actually synthesizing the information, you have those key details?
Yeah, I think I should have prefaced with just start writing. Before you can just start writing, you have to just start reading, right? I think having, if you're a first year student in the field, I think it's important that you have to, I think before you even hit the bench, when you start your time in a lab, likely the first several weeks to up to a month is reading review papers, reading primary manuscripts, recent and those that are further off in the past, but doing a lot of reading. And I would say writing sort of little synopses and small descriptions of each paper for yourself, and sort of setting those aside and organizing that on your computer in different folders, so that when you are ready to start writing, you have those papers at your fingertips. Yeah, no, it's really important that you read as much as possible, because most of your master's and your PhD, as you all know, it's self-taught, right? There's the stuff that you learn at the bench, the technical skills, but then the field, it's mainly through reading. How else do you find out about what's being done? So just start reading, then just start writing.
Well said, Lee. That's a good point. So I do have two questions that are coming through the chat. I'll ask the first one, maybe you can answer it. So how do you manage writing as a group? And on that note, how would you go about authorship and choosing the order of authors?
How do I manage writing as a group?
Mm-hmm.
So it depends, right? It depends on sort of where the original idea for the review paper comes from. I think probably the most probable scenario is your PI is being invited to write a review paper, and they sort of just put it out there to whoever is the main project manager of that particular project. So one particular PhD student or several PhD students may be put together to write it. And I think, again, I think it depends on your PI, right? Because I mean, your PI is ultimately the senior author. So some of that guidance comes from them. The review papers that I've done, so using myself as an example from our lab, we usually have 2-3 people contributing. I'm a fairly small lab because I just started, but I would have different students working on different sections. And then we would then bring them all together. And normally I would say senior author or a more senior PhD student or postdoc who would then try to look at everything and make sure that the transitions are good and that everything sort of coalesces together. So I think to try to address maybe some labs that are bigger. So I did spend, my postdoc was in a very large lab with Dr. John Bell. And there, some of the ideas for writing a review paper may come from the graduate students themselves or from postdocs. In that case, then I would probably still approach my PI and say, this is my idea, this is my pitch, what do you think? I'm going to have this and this other people in the lab to sort of put this together. I think it's important that you do go away and write your own sections, but that you guys have a common outline and that you meet periodically, maybe after 1 week of writing or after a couple of weeks of writing, to make sure you guys are all on the same theme.
Okay, great. A few more questions coming in the chat, and for those of you who want to ask a question by audio, feel free to jump in. So the next question, which actually I'll ask you today because it's great to have your point of view, but to the person asking this, just a heads up that we're actually going to be having a webinar on scientific illustration and representing your data through graphics in a later webinar. But at any rate, the question is, what kind of software do you use for making figures? And so perhaps the figures you're talking about for the review may be more theoretical or less data oriented and more conceptually based. So do you have thoughts on either data or those other types of figures?
Yeah, for figures, so I think a lot of students are probably much better at this than I am. I'm very old school, and I make very ugly pictures if it's just me, but my students make much better pictures. For me personally, I use like PowerPoint, which is really, really bad. I know other people who use Photoshop and Illustrator. I think those are much more powerful software to manipulate figures. But there are lots of web resources that have sort of free versions that are not the full version, but there's free versions of and again, the name escapes me that we use in our lab, but I can provide the link and send it to you, Megan, later on. But there's different, is it BioRender, I think? Yeah, that's it, BioRender. They have some amazing graphics that can be used. A free version of the software versus paid versions. But even then, I think it's important that in order to have authorship, to make sure that the publication rights and everything is safe, it's important that you do make your own figures, or that you at least, you have to make sure that you cite the figure that you are adapting, or that you're reformatting, or that you are inspired from from making. But normally, to avoid all that, most of my trainees sort of make their own figures using various software. But I think BioRender is something that we use quite often.
Okay, great. And yeah, Lee, if you send me that info, I can send it out with the slide in this recording. And just on that note, someone did write in the chat box that Severe Medical Art PPT, so maybe PowerPoint helps a lot. So that's another potential recommendation. So in terms of the next question, it's what's your advice for ensuring that a review gathers the highest number of citations? In other words, do you have any stylistic, psychological strategies to make the writing as compelling and appealing as possible?
How to become a good writer. That's I think the honest answer to that is it'll take time, right? Your first paper, your first review paper may not be the best piece of writing, but I think by the time you reach more seniority, if you're lucky enough to write multiple review papers during your PhD or your postdoc, I would say the more you are engaged in your field, the more experiments that you do, the more you learn about the advancements in the field, and the more you contribute scientifically to your field, the more you know about it, the better you will be. And then in terms of how do you then communicate that in a review paper, I think it's not easy. And again, this webinar wasn't about how to be a good writer. I think writing is probably one of the hardest things to do. I think as scientists, we're not trained to be good writers, and I think writing is something that's extremely hard, especially scientific writing. But I think one way to become a better scientific writer is to read other review papers and see and look at ones that you particularly like, and then sort of note down for yourself, what is it about this paper that I like? Was it that it was really engaging and easy to read? I read it once and I fully understood it, or this one didn't make any sense. It was so convoluted and complicated. So I think it's important that first, without any writing ability, you need to at least read what a good writing looks like, and then to just start, and then to revise and have your mentors, your PIs, and other professors take a look at it for you. And then the more you do it, the better you'll become.
Perfect. Classic. Practice makes perfect, right? So another question came in. Basically, when writing a mini review, because of the limit and your restrictions in that respect, how deep should you go in terms of your thesis, and how do you suggest focusing on a particular point?
Sorry. I think a mini review is much harder to write than a large review, that's for sure. How do you sort of focus the topic? How do you?
I think so. How do you make it poignant and I guess having your thesis really be prominent? How do you pick your topic maybe? And Adrian, if you want to, if I'm terribly throwing off what you're trying to say, jump in. But yeah, maybe start with that.
Go ahead.
Or Lee, maybe on that first point, how do you go about going? How deep of a dive do you do in a short review?
I think the most important thing is I would say to just almost like your very first draft, to just get it out there. Like, don't be afraid of it not sounding right. Don't be afraid of the grammar being wrong. Or I would say just have a sit down with yourself and just like throw it up, regurgitate, sort of put it on paper, the first things that come to your mind, using the most direct language possible. The results show that it's okay to be boring because this is your first draft. So I think that the most important way is to use very direct language, say exactly what you want to say, and sort of write that out as a very first draft, and then going back through it and maybe stretching it out, or because the hard part I think is condensing it down, right? So I think it's important for a short mini review versus larger reviews, that with a short review you really need to get to the core topics that are important, and say exactly what you want to say without going into too much of the other material. I hope that makes sense.
Start broad and maybe edit it down to really focus your point. Is that kind of what you're?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay. And then another question. how far, actually, yes, how far back can we go when reviewing papers? And Lee, it's 1:11, so a few more minutes. I know you had mentioned that there is more time. So for those of you who might have to leave at 11:50, or excuse me, at 1:15, this may be one of the last questions. So just a reminder, as Lee mentioned, these webinars will be, this is being recorded, and Lee also agreed to share her slides. So I'll be sending that out along with a survey that I'd really appreciate you guys filling out just to get some feedback on webinars. And I'm hearing a few nuanced ideas of perhaps writing style and things like that could be a good topic. So stay tuned for that. So again, Lee will stay on the line, but for those of you who have to leave, stay tuned for that email. So Lee, again, that question is, how far back should folks go in writing review papers?
In terms of what other reviews they'll reference, or just papers in general that they'll put in their reference?
Good question. I suspect how the papers that you would put in.
It depends, right? If it's on some major breakthrough that happened back in 1918, I think that deserves to be cited in your paper if that was when the first discovery was made. But in general, I would say, you know, given that we're in 2020, you probably don't want to go back further than 2000 for the most part, right? But there are some discoveries that did take place before that. I was alive then to remember them. So I think it depends on the discovery, depends on how important a particular primary paper is. I mean, I don't think there's a hard and fast rule as to, you know, references have to be from 2000 and onwards. It really depends on on the significance of that particular discovery, on that particular reference. But on the whole, I think, you know, you want to try to keep it, you know, because science moves forward at such a fast pace. I mean, like, most of the papers on COVID haven't even been published, but there's over like 65, 70, 80 papers on preprints, and they're just coming out every single day. So I would say, you know, in the last 10, 15 years, you probably should be looking at those papers, those discoveries to include in your review paper.
Okay, next question. In respect to the number of authors, how many would be acceptable for a review?
In my opinion, I always feel like less is more, because I think, you know, it would be really, really hard to sort of reconcile 15 different authors. I mean, how on earth do they all really contribute to the writing, right? So, I mean, and again, it depends. If you're writing a review for Lancet or for the New England Journal of Medicine, I mean, you know, it's a completely different story altogether. But I think for review papers, in my opinion, I think less is more. I mean, you know, there's the main postdoc or the main PhD student and a couple of others in the lab, plus the senior author, maybe a couple of collaborators who are helping. But for a lot of journals, if you have more than, I think, 8 or 9 authors, they ask you to explain why. They want to sort of get rid of these guest authorships, etc. So I think, you know, for review papers, it shouldn't really be much more than a handful.
Okay, great, thanks. Next question. In your opinion, do review articles make a difference when applying to postdoc scholarships or faculty positions? And maybe you can answer whether it makes a difference if you're first author versus second, third, et cetera, author on those.
Yeah. So I guess this is sort of the dose of reality for postdoc positions or for PI positions?
Perhaps both.
Oh, yeah. I think at the trainee level, to get into a really good postdoc lab, I think any kind of publication is good. Obviously, your postdoc lab wants you to have primary papers, right? If you just have review papers to the exclusion of everything else, then I don't think that'll help. But if you have your first author papers, several, if possible, and if you have scholarships and you have review papers on top of it, and you're involved and everything, then yeah, it certainly helps. But I think a review paper on its own is not the only thing that's going to land you a good position in a postdoc lab. For a PI position, that's true even more. I mean, they're looking for first author manuscripts. And second author, if I answer the second part of the question, if it's not a first author review paper, what about a second author, third author? Sure, like co-authorships, whether it's a primary paper, whether it's a review paper, it's all helpful. But at the end of the day, they want to look at exactly what was your concrete contribution in terms of first author manuscripts and first author reviews, if you've got everything else for a good postdoc position and for a job.
Okay, and I'm just reading this one actively. So what is the acceptable percentage of review papers that can be cited in the review article as references? Okay, so how many review papers in review articles?
And that's kind of, that gets down to sort of, I am not the editor for Nature. I'm not, I'm not really sure what is the acceptable percentage. I think from, I don't know, if I pull a random review paper from a good reputable journal, I would say the majority of it is primary papers, right? And then I mean, it's a review paper that's bringing together your viewpoint, your synthesis of primary papers. I mean, you're not just taking a bunch of review papers and putting it together. So I would say the good majority of your references should be primary papers. And then the minority of it would be other review papers. But I don't have a hard and fast percentage calculation.
Okay, there is another question coming in, and just a reminder, folks, if you have any questions for Lee in terms of her professional and career trajectory, feel free to ask those as well. But Lee, in terms of the following question, it is, in your experience, what is the least level of expertise you have seen publishing a review article to overcome this potential lack possibility to the perspective of the journal? Should you add more experts in the field to the paper to increase your chances of acceptance? Yeah, I'll stop there, and maybe it's a two-part question.
Yeah, no, I can answer that question very honestly. I just came across it. I mean, I'm a junior PI. I've had my lab for now about, I'm going into my third 3.5 years in. And one of the papers, one of our review papers, we had originally submitted to Trends in Immunology, and that's a Cell publication paper. So, and unfortunately, it got rejected. The proposal was rejected, and very unfortunate, but very real. One of the reviewers said, you know, how can this early career investigator who hasn't had, you know, this many years under her belt, how can she be writing a review paper on this topic? So that was very painful. I think very unfair, but ultimately, you know what, there's going to be you're going to come across a lot of naysayers, a lot of people who direct negative comments at you, critique you for all kinds of reasons. You know, you're too junior, you're too this, you're too that, or not enough of this, not enough of that. But I think, and one of the things I put in, if you get rejected, it's okay. You can pitch it to somewhere else. Or if you want to, you can suck it up and say, okay, you know what, I'm going to add in someone with more expertise. But at that point, I was like, I don't want to add another senior person to my review paper, because why don't my comments count? I have been working in this field. There aren't too many people working in this particular subfield. So instead of continue to pursue Trends, I decided, you know what, I'm going to submit to a different home for this particular review paper, to to the Journal of Immune Therapy of Cancer, and they accepted it wholeheartedly. They didn't question that I was too junior or didn't know enough or whatever. So I think, you know, reality is, we'd like to think that everybody is nice and everybody will get a chance, but you are going to come across people who will who will put obstacles in front of you and prevent you from succeeding. And at that point, I think, you know, talking to your mentors is really important. And then ultimately deciding what you want out of this. What is your goal? Do you want to get this published and reach the widest audience possible, or do you want to publish it in a niche elite paper, really? You know, so at the end of the day, you have to make the call, but there are always options.
Thanks, Lee. I think that was a really honest answer and a difficult problem to have. So that's it with respect to the questions in the chat. If there are no other questions from folks, then I might ask the last one, and that is, so folks on the call are motivated, they're ready to start reading, they're ready to start writing. What is the piece of advice you might give them for today? What can they do today to help things along?
I would say the weather is beautiful, go for a walk.
Yeah.
Go clear your head, get some fresh air. Think about it as you're walking. Stay, you know, socially distant, 2 meters apart from other people on the sidewalk and stuff like that. But then come in and you know, I think most of you probably have different ideas in your head from the different projects that you've been working on, from your meetings and your discussions with your own individual respective PIs, and then come home and put together an outline. I think that's really, really important. Don't start writing just yet. Put together an outline, and then through Zoom, through Teams, whatever your preferred software is, have a discussion with your PIs to what they think of your outline, and then maybe start writing. I would say don't just start writing just yet. Just start writing. Make sure that the scope is okay, that the ideas are good. Come together with an outline, and then start putting it together.
Great, thanks, Lee. So I
Okay.
think that concludes the webinar. I've thrown on the ways that you can stay in touch with BioCanRx. And again, you'll be hearing from me momentarily regarding the survey and the slides and this the recorded webinar. So with that, thanks everyone for your participation. There were some really great questions from you, and I hope we see you again in future webinars. So, and again, obviously, Lee, thanks so much for participating. It was a really great insight from you.
Thank you so much, guys. It was a pleasure. Have a
Take
good
care,
day.
everyone. Enjoy your walks. Bye now.
Goodbye.